handouts. So if anyone needs a copy, Harold's got some in the back. I've got a few up here, and then if we start to run short, we'll get some extra copies made. So does everybody have a copy? Anybody need one? Good. All right, so this is lesson number 6 in our study, Fundamentals of the Faith. Of course, last week we talked about the unique identity of the church. We talked about some of our identifying marks, and of course, again, everything that we do, our only authority, again, is what? The Bible, right? We don't rely on any kind of man-made creeds or agreements or councils or anything of that nature. Everything that we pattern our worship and our belief system around is what we find in the Bible, what Jesus' teaching is for us. So this morning we're going to kind of dive in a little bit deeper and look at the organization of the church. 2 weeks ago, this was one of the small topics that I had in that lesson, but we talked about there's basically 2 senses when we talk about church, 2 senses of the church. And one of those being that church is the individual group of people, the group of believers in one specific location, but then we also look at it in a universal sense. And kind of looking at, when Jesus started talking about the whole concept of church in Matthew 16, and of course, again, this is a reoccurring theme. This verse, I think, is going to be key to everything that we're talking about. But if you remember, I think in all 6 lessons so far, we've discussed this one verse, Matthew 16:18. After Peter's confession, Jesus mentioning that he would build his church upon that confession. So in that regard, we're looking at a universal sense, all the entire body of believers, right, all across time. 1 Corinthians 7:17, this is what I've commanded in all churches. So again, that's a universal sense of church. But then we dive in a little bit deeper. If you're looking at the outline, Roman numeral 1, item B, in a local sense. So in Acts chapter 13, in the local church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers. 1 Corinthians, again, 1:2, to God's church at Corinth. And this is really where we're going to focus in today, is looking at the local organization, the makeup of each individual body. Of course, again, the first thing we have to remember and keep at the forefront of our mind always is who's head of the church? Christ. And again, it sounds elementary, but this is something we have to remember and we have to keep at the forefront of our focus at all times, is Christ is head. He is authority. Whatever he said, whatever he established is what we must follow. Again, that's not up for discussion. That's not up for debate. And that's something, again, as in America, we live in a democracy, right? And we like to, again, we have different rights. We have our First Amendment right, right to free speech. When we disagree on something, we want to be able to express our opinions and, live or conduct ourselves in the way we want. That's one of the freedoms of democracy. However, that's not the case when we're following Jesus, right? I mean, because if you look at the religious world today, that whole thought, of I want to do what I want, again, what man's desires are, I think has led to a lot of the division, a lot of confusion, a lot of people being led astray. So again, we got to get back down to, if it's not what Jesus said or what he authorized, then we're going to be in error. So I think that, again, is one of the things we have to keep at the forefront of our mind always. And I think the next section here, Christ is King, Revelation 17:14, he is Lord of lords. He is King of kings. So he has all authority over everything we do, everything we believe, and how we conduct ourselves in worship. Again, there's no earthly head, and when we're talking about the individual local church and the body as a whole, Christ is head. There is no earthly headquarters. We don't have any kind of organized structure in that regard. There's a lot of organizations throughout the world that, have this major hierarchy, and, it was discussed, I think, even maybe last week about how, it's, in a sense, at times, some organizations turn into a business. And, you can see that right now with some of the organizations that we have throughout the world, religious organizations. We don't have a pope. We don't have an archdeacon. We don't have a cardinal president. Any kinds of those things. We don't have, any council or synod. When we look at how we conduct ourselves, again, the Bible is very clear in that for this local church, who has authority over what we decide? Again, high level, ultimately it's Jesus, but when we get back down to the local level, who guides and makes the decisions for us? Our elders, right? And again, we're going to dive into that as our next topic. But again, that's, how the Bible and how Jesus ultimately wanted each individual church to conduct themselves. Because when you think about it, how good are we going to be in making a decision or guiding somebody in another state, in another town, really in another side of town? We don't have, or again, thinking even farther, again, if you look at these global hierarchies, even in another country, unless you're planted here and know what everybody's, every person that's within this body, what's going on in their lives, what's going on within the community, you can't make right decisions, correct? You have to be planted in the place where, where you're making that influence. I've mentioned this a couple times, but, got the opportunity to go overseas into Ukraine for interacting with some churches there. Again, this was, had the opportunity in the early 2000s where we established some churches where I was going to church at the time, right after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. So they were able to bring in missionaries, get folks planted. And then, I enjoyed the fruits of seeing, a few years of that growth. But again, even though the elders where I was attending helped facilitate getting the aid there, getting teachers over there, getting evangelists over there, they did not make decisions, because that was one of the very first things that occurred is when a body of believers was established. They, again, patterned their decisions after what we see in the New Testament and appointed themselves elders. They made those decisions. So again, I think it's vitally important for us to really still understand that. So any questions, comments so far? I know I'm blazing through right now, but any thoughts anybody has at the moment? All right, well, let's dive into item 3. Each local church or congregation is to be overseen by elders. Let's hold two passages. So turn to Acts chapter 14, verse 23, and then also we'll look at Titus chapter 1, verse 5. And we'll be hopping around these quite frequently, so if you want to go ahead and mark those, feel free to. So Acts 14:23. When they had appointed elders in every church and prayed with fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. And flipping over to Titus 1:5. The reason I left you in Crete was to set right what was left done, and as I directed you, to appoint elders in every town. So again, this is, the Acts that Luke mentioned this in Acts, where we see the establishment of bodies of believers as the church is in its infancy. But then also Paul's writing here to Titus, mentioning that that's one of the key components whenever they went into an area and evangelized. One of the first things that had to occur was the establishment and appointment of elders for each one of those local churches. Why do you guys think that would be one of the first things that the apostles focused on whenever they reached out to folks in the first century?
We needed elders to see over the congregation, to watch out for the Bible says wolves that will come in. And I think that's where we really need strong elders guys that are not easily persuaded with everything that comes. There's so many things that come into the church, and I think that's when we need strong elders that are not easily swayed by what they hear and what they are taught.
You're stealing a little bit of my thunder, because we're gonna look into that quite a bit. While we're in Titus, let's go ahead and look at that. So that's element B here under Roman numeral 3. So let's just read the rest of that passage. Titus 1, verses 5 through 9. So again it says, as I directed you to appoint elders in every town, it says, someone who is blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of wildness or rebellion. For an overseer, as God's manager, must be blameless, not arrogant, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not a bully, not greedy for money, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, righteous, holy, self-controlled, holding to the faithful message as taught, so that he will be able to encourage with sound teaching and to rebuke those who contradict it. So again, that's one of the key elements, that for a healthy church to flourish and thrive is, you got to have establishment of elders, folks that can, again, to shepherd the flock. And when we talked about the body a few weeks ago, we described the church as being a flock, and Jesus being the good shepherd. And we had that description of anybody who's interacted with any kind of livestock understands that they very quickly can get themselves in a lot of trouble. They can stray from where they need to be, and we are exactly like that. When we look at ourselves, at humans, and in God's eyes, that's the direct, in my mind at least, that's a direct description of us as well. So I think, again, that's why we see such a strong emphasis on having men who are able to help guide us, to help teach us, oversee us when we do stray. They're able to correct, again, lovingly. Also able to think through, where are we as an organization, as a body of believers? What direction are we going? Are we really fulfilling our true purpose? How easy is it for us to, or looking at myself, how easy is it for me to lose focus of that? That ultimately, when I go back to and I always keep this in the back of my mind, my whole goal in life is love God and then love each other. So I'm trying to, to the best of my abilities, live out what God's asked me to live out, to be transformed, to be the salt and light to the earth. And in doing so, then, one of my big calls is to provide that positive influence, let people see, the change that God's made in my life, because ultimately we're called to bring as many people back to Christ, to restore that relationship for them, right? So again, I think that's, one of the other big things that elders do is they help guide the direction and keep us focused on our vision. Our vision ultimately is to get to God and bring as many there as well. So I think, again, that's another real important element in that that hierarchy, and the way that Jesus ultimately laid out leadership in the church. There's also a recurring theme. Do you ever see description of one elder for a congregation? Always, correct? And again, there's not a hard and fast rule that it has to be X, Y, Z, but it's always more than one. Why do you think that's important? Exactly. And then also, we start teetering back into, some of these other organized religions in the world, that ultimately fall under the authority of, especially the one that comes to mind, ultimately of one person. And that's not at all what Jesus envisioned for us. What would be some of the dangers in having one elder in a congregation?
The risk of them starting to look too highly of themselves in a position.
I'm sorry. And then going back and looking at the description of an elder or an overseer, that's a pretty lofty set of characteristics for a person to be able to live by. And I think we're also looking at that in generality. Most of the time, that person's that way, but are they perfect at it? No, because none of us are perfect, right? We all fall short. So I think there's also, as you mentioned, there's a level of accountability when we have more than one elder. When, again, we're all subject to falling short and sinning, when church leaders are no different, because from the day that, we are aware of sin, that, we're falling short of God's will until, I'm looking at myself, until the day that I die. Guess what? I will be sinning from back then up until the day I take my last breath. So, I think we all, having multiple elders in that regard, they can help keep themselves in check. Also think about what kind of different personalities do people have. Some people connect much better with different personalities. Then we also look at, what kind of gifts are we all given? One person may be extremely gifted in several areas, but they're not gifted in all. So again, I think we've got to look at that in our church leadership, and then also how we leverage the body, leveraging each other's strengths. And again, I use this time at work too. We're always trying to leverage our strengths and then shoring up each other's weaknesses. So when you put somebody in an area where they're going to excel and backfill areas that they're weak in, then you can become successful. I think that's the exact same thing in the church. We collectively, if we're focusing on our mission again is to love God with all of our being, and then bring others to Him. Again, having that plurality. Again, I think that's another, to me, another part of the reason why we need more than one. Has anybody else thought? I'm just kind of throwing this out there. Is any other thoughts that anybody else could think of why we need person in that leadership role?
Well, a group of men is a stronger force than one. It's just like when Paul spoke to the elders in Ephesus before he departed to go to Jerusalem, he was saying very strong words. He said, I'm going to tell you, the ravenous wolves will come in from outside. And he also said, beware of men who will rise up among you and draw disciples away. So elders have to be aware of the world and within. And, I mean, those were strong warnings. I mean, Paul was warning of their duty to the church that Christ followed his own blood to be aware of these things.
Most definitely, and I don't know if, I mean, I've seen situations throughout my life where, that has occurred even in eldership, and, just thinking about many years ago, one congregation I was at where, a couple of the elders had kind of lost sight of their call, and it was disastrous for that specific congregation. So again, I think being able to keep yourselves in check is a huge part of having that plurality.
The advent of social media, I know as I was growing up, all the churches of Christ seemed to be fairly consistent, traveling around the country. Well, then in the 80s and 90s, many controversies and changes took place. But that's also when social media was flourishing. So it's a very real thing today to stay true to the Word.
One other thought, let's just turn over there real fast. Let's go to Acts 20. We've got a plurality of elders. Again, keeping each other in check, being able to leverage each other's, abilities and strengths to most effectively shepherd the congregation that you're at, being able to reach out, and whatnot. But then also, there's another key component, and not talking about the plurality, but the elders' oversight is really only for the specific location, the specific congregation that they're a part of. So Acts 20, verse 28, if I can find it here. Be on guard for yourselves, for all the flock among whom the Holy Spirit has appointed you as overseers to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. So again, that's focused, that's telling the elders, they're only to provide that oversight guidance for that specific location, that specific congregation. I'm not even going to attempt, I've got it written out with the phonics here for the different Greek words for elders used in the New Testament. And Josh, I got to figure out how every lesson I hone in on always has these Greek words I'm supposed to pronounce. We got to figure. That's right. So one of these, which I think is, presbyteros, I think that's been translated. Again, that's the one that we look at most frequently, at elder or presbyter. Episkopos is another one that's been used in the in the original Greek translation, and that again is a description of an overseer or bishop. And then poimen, that's a description of a shepherd or a pastor. That's found, both of those I think are found in passage in Acts chapter 20. I put the wrong verse. It's actually verse 17 instead of verse 12 like I put there. But verse 17 and verse 28. And then also passage in 1 Peter 5, 1 and 2. And again, that one I think captures all three of them. It says the elders
presbyteros, who are among you, I exhort, shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers. So then that passage of Peter's description, we see all three of those Greek words being used. I think that's also one of the challenges with the English language. Think about how many different ways there are to describe love, but in the English language there's only one. So I think in the Hebrew and even the Greek also, multiple ways to describe the same person, same role. Again, here also with when we're looking at the English translation, I think that kind of waters down and maybe even confuses us a little bit, or it does me at least, of what the role of an elder actually is. And I think the one here I keep seeing is pastor. I mean, when you hear the word pastor, what automatically comes to mind, right, in today's time? Preacher or minister, right? I think again that's I don't have the means to accurately describe it, but again, in my interpretation, I think that's part of where we've got the English Bible. Maybe there's been some confusion over time as far as what that word actually means, but it's been watered down now to a point of, or really to me misapplied, I guess would be a better way to say that is, when you hear pastor, you don't think of an elder. You think of a minister or somebody in that role, the evangelist. But ultimately, when you go back again to the Greek translation, that word was describing an overseer, an elder, a bishop, a presbyter, someone who's overseeing the flock. So I think that's something we've got to always keep in mind as well. Any thoughts? I'm sorry. And ultimately, when you look at Jesus, what kind of leader was he? He led by serving. And I think again that's what we've got to expect and really demand out of our overseers is that servant leadership. But ultimately, when we're serving each other, when we're leading each other, we're doing it by serving. One of the to me, the key elements for an elder and shows the enormity of what kind of role they take on is found in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. It says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. So they can do this with joy and not with grief, for what would be unprofitable for you." So when you think about, again, anybody that's in a leadership role, you're subject to, gripes, complaints, whatever you do, somebody's not going to like, those kinds of things. But when you think about the pressure that's applied to them, those of us who may be in a leadership position in our work, that's stressful. At the end of the day, I don't have people's souls hanging over my head. That always gives me pause when I think about, when I question or don't agree with maybe a decision that's made. But then put yourself in your shoes. Think about, how many people we got generally? Like last week we had 347 in attendance. And our elders have those souls. They're responsible for that. So the decisions they make, good or bad, and, leading folks to Jesus, they're going to be held accountable for that. And, that's also, we see some descriptions within the Bible for those that, are given much demanded. Again, I know I didn't phrase that effective or exactly, but, that's the general thought there. And again, we really got to think about, if we want to complain or whatnot, think about, you know, the fact that they've taken on a pretty heavy lift. And I think we've got to be, you know, patient, be understanding, and knowing that, you know, hey, we may not necessarily like the decision because of, you know, my own personal wants or desires or whatnot, but they're trying their best to make decisions that are in the best interest for us as individuals, but for this body. So again, I think, you know, let's give each other some grace in that regard.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think obviously the activity that we have to live as members, I'm sure they're dealing with things that none of us may even know about, but they weigh heavily, you know, about the congregation. So see something with us on the outside, but there may be far greater things weighing on them. Can't imagine the amount of pressure all the time. So yes, we definitely have a duty to them as well.
Any other thoughts or comments before we?
Sometimes you have to look at leadership with the idea that they have personalities just like we do. Some can be extroverts, some can be introverts, and they can assume certain roles that we sometimes prejudge and get us in trouble thinking somebody's taking over or becoming a one-man show. And they all work together as a team and caring for us. And that's easy for us as humans to prejudge sometimes, and we shouldn't.
All right. Yes, sir.
I think it's just human nature, like Bob was saying. When you get a group of men, one or two is extroverted, or maybe one might end up as the most, the one in charge. It's human nature. I think about Jesus chose 12 men as his apostles. We hear very little about most of them, except for two, and that's Peter. You know, you think he's always the one that speaks up. Matthew 16:18. And then we hear about John some. But like Bob said, I don't think Peter ended up as the guy in charge. They all had to work together, and they scattered after Jesus died and rose again. They had propagated the church all over the Mediterranean. But it's just a natural thing. And so we have to, I heard you say, well, a while ago, some key words. You said they keep check on each other. And I think that's part of it.
Yeah, and then again, this is, I've spent a lot more time right here, but, than probably time really allows, but I think, you know, again, that's in my mind, you know, our church leaders, I think, dictate whether or not we're successful in our walk. I feel very fortunate here, you know, the folks that we've got that are overseeing us. That's, again, one of the reasons that when we came here about a year and a half ago, that was one of the reasons, you know, this is, in my mind, this is home, because I, you know, feel confident in, you know, their oversight and the decisions that they make for us. I'm going to have to really ramp it up for us to get through here. Thinking about each local church, each congregation, you know, again, we have to remember that we are autonomous, subject ultimately, though, to Christ's rules. So 1 Corinthians 4:17, it says, "He will remind you about my ways in Christ Jesus, just as I teach everywhere in every church." I have to remember that, again, the church is autonomous in that they can manage their own affairs. They're not subject to another man-made council or organization. And again, no person or authority outside or above the local congregation, makes the decisions. Ultimately, it's going to be Christ, right? So, kind of think about, again, when we look at the Christian religion as a whole, I'm diving into, I guess, some denominationalism here, but, when you look at how many different organizational structures there are in what, evangelical Christians or whatnot, you see a lot of those groups that don't necessarily follow that pattern. But again, I guess I go back to what pattern do we have in the New Testament? Local, autonomous groups living out to the best of their abilities the call they've been given, and responding to the gospel, and then trying to bring as many people to Christ as they can. One of the ways, though, that we see interaction and cooperation, congregations grouping together, evangelism, edification and benevolence. Think about when there's a major weather event or major disaster in areas, what happens immediately in the aftermath. Folks that aren't affected, you see groups of churches banding together to try to get aid to those that are in most need. Think about what's going to be coming up here in April, with our seminar coming up. We had many groups of folks last year at our Equip seminar. We're going to have more this year. I think, what was it? We sent out mailers to, is it over 1,000 different churches? I think. Am I right in that? 1,006. So again, we're trying to band together, to edify each other, to build each other up, but we're not necessarily making decisions for other groups, and they're not making decisions for us. But that is some of the ways that, we can get together and be effective. Again, also evangelism, thinking about when we bring in guest speakers, or, Hiram mentioned this morning, he's going to be heading down for a seminar in Florida. Timing may be, he's escaping the cold, but again, he's, filling an important work there in that, he's helping to edify and evangelize at different locations. So that's some of the ways, again, that congregations can cooperate, but again, ultimately and finally, the oversight and the decisions are made at the local group. We'll see if I can get finished here. So each local church or congregation is also to establish servants, what we call deacons. And then, of course, we're all servants, but the church is established and patterned in a way that we are, we've asked to have folks with specific duties to carry out, the earthly needs of the church. And let's read that real fast. Acts chapter 6. Of course, that's when we see the apostles designating that type of servant as a deacon, even though it's not actually mentioned in the passage. But Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. It says, "In those days, as the number of the disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint by the Hellenistic Jews against the Hebraic Jews that their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution. Then the 12 summoned the whole company of the disciples and said, 'It would not be right for us to give up preaching about God to wait on tables. Therefore, brothers, select from among you 7 men of good reputation, full of the Spirit and wisdom, whom we can adopt to this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the preaching ministry.' The proposal pleased the whole company. So they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and the Holy Spirit, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenius, and Nicholas, a proselyte from Antioch. they had them stand before the apostles who prayed and laid their hands on them. So the preaching about God flourished. The number of the disciples in Jerusalem multiplied greatly, and a large group of priests became obedient to the faith. So again, here we see that specific need being met. So is it beneficial or effective if our elders or overseers are constantly worrying about daily needs of the body? If they're worried, if their ultimate responsibility is caring for the flock and the spiritual needs of the body, then if they're caring for daily needs, physical needs, they're being pulled away from their, I'm sorry for that, they're being pulled away from their true calling, right? So again, that's showing us why we need, servants in a different role to be able to administer to the physical needs of the body. So any thoughts on that one before we hit warp drive here and try to finish up? I'm sorry.
Delegate out the responsibilities to the deacons to fulfill that.
And then again, we've got several deacons in the assembly right now, but you guys are tasked with specific different areas based on either your abilities or wherever you are in your walk in life at the moment. But again, when a need arises, not bogging the elders or overseers down in those physical elements, that's when you're tasked with fulfilling the physical needs. The last one is when we're looking at the organization. Of course, each church needs an evangelist or evangelist to preach the gospel. And again, same thing. While all Christians are called to preach to the lost, we still need people who are gifted in that regard, right? We need people who can, proclaim Christ's message as is mentioned in 1 Timothy 2:7, able to spread the good news of Christ, 2 Timothy 4:5, preach the word, proclaim the message, 2 Timothy 4:2. I look at, Neil and Hiram and their abilities. If you asked me to try to do that on a daily basis, I would fail miserably. That's not where I'm gifted. This right here is a stretch for me, to be honest. Trying to come up with a outline and create cohesive thoughts. But they are extremely gifted in that regard. And to think about how they've committed the Bible to memory, and how regardless of whatever topic is coming up, that quick recall of passages that are specific and applicable to that whatever topic has come up. So again, having that ability, is again another vital element to the church and being able for us to function effectively. We need folks that can effectively reach out, not have this monotone voice like I've got, being able to keep folks engaged, bring that message and bring, present it in a way that it actually does, like as the Bible say, pricks our heart, ultimately leads us to repentance. Make sure that, when we are failing in a regard, the message is received and we can, grow from that, repent from whatever we're failing at. But then ultimately, also with folks that haven't received the word before, being able to present it in a way that it's, is able that they can absorb it, they can hear it, understand it, and then hopefully ultimately respond in that regard. So finally, kind of just wrapping all this up, conclusion. I know I devote a lot more time in one area than the others, but we have to still remember Christ is the head of the church, both from a universal standpoint, but then also looking at the
the individual location, the individual congregation. Jesus did set up, an organizational structure for us. And we've got the Bible as the authority that shows us the example that we use to organize, if I can get that out, organize leadership within the church. Big thing, there is no scriptural authority for modern forms of church government outside, again, the pattern of having multiple elders serving each local congregation. And finally, the New Testament church is to be organized according to the pattern that we find in the New Testament. So any deviation from that pattern, at the end of the day, creates a man-made organization. So I flew through the last part of that. Has anybody else got any thoughts or comments before we wrap up? Again, I appreciate everyone's time and thoughts. Next week, our topic is the mission and work of the church. So just kind of think about that. The mission and work of the church will be our topic for next week. Thank you all for your participation and attendance.